am a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. We call ourselves Onieda, which means people of the Standing Stone. We are one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, which is better known as the Iroquois or Iroquois Confederacy. But we call ourselves the Haudenosaunee, which is people of the Longhouse. Our tribe and these 6 nations are originally from the upper New York State area, the Finger Lakes area, and our part of the tribe moved to Wisconsin in the early 1800s and created a new homeland in Wisconsin. So I'm Wisconsin Oneida, and I'm Turtle Clan. We have 3 clans in the Oneida Nation: the Wolf Clan, the Bear Clan, and the Turtle Clan. And I include a turtle in all of my paintings somewhere. Sometimes they're very obvious and sometimes they're rather hidden. But there's always a turtle. So I will start off by acknowledging the native people of the area in Indiana and thank them for their patronage of and being the base for this show at the Eiteljorg Museum. But I'll show you a couple of my completed works. I have been working on a series over a number of years, and I hope you can see this, including the turtle, which I actually started at the museum over 10 years ago when I was doing an artist in residency. I had big plans to do a large piece of each of the 13 moons of the year, and there are 13 corresponding large plates on the back of the turtle, so we call the turtle our calendar. And as I said, I had great aspirations to get this done many years ago, and it always got put on the back shelf. And one of the positive benefits of this year of COVID has been that it gave me time to complete finally the series, which I am now working on finding a publisher for a children's book for the series. So I'll show you another piece. I'm here in my studio, so I'm hoping you can see as much as you can see. This is one of the moons of the year. The piece that you just saw would be the cover or the introductory page of the book, and this is actually the bean moon. As I said, I'm looking for a publisher. I actually have a couple of publishers interested, but I guess there's a whole process to go through, and I have to find a literary agent first. So, and that seems to be even harder than finding a publisher. But anyway, I spend a lot of time doing research for my paintings. I don't consider myself typical in the way I approach a painting at all, but I always have a lot of symbolic meaning and elements in my painting that are related to my tribe or the woodland people. And so I try to get everything right and do a lot of research, and I work from photographs primarily. So I look for photographs that I can use as references in my work. And I'm getting ready to start a piece, which I will be demonstrating on today, which is about my grandmother. And this is the photograph that inspired me. This is my grandmother and my great-grandmother sometime in the 1930s, sitting on the side of the road, weaving baskets. So that was my inspiration for this piece. along with something I've been, well, and I got sucked into a lot of research on this painting because I knew my grandmother had attended Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was one of the first, I believe it was the first Native American boarding school. And so I also just did a lot of research just for my own personal family history of finding out how that all worked and finding out more than I probably wanted to, because it was certainly something my grandmother never talked about, except very occasionally when something would jog her memory, or she had something relevant to say, but it was not something that she generally talked about. So that is the piece that I will be working on. And as I said, I always do a lot of research. I have found numerous photographs that I've been working from. And this is the piece as it is so far. It's in the very beginning stages. So it's basically going to be about assimilation. And that is what nominally the Native boarding schools were intended to assimilate the Indian tribes into the European culture. And the founder of Carlisle, his modus operandi was kill the Indian. he basically wanted to wipe out the culture. And one of the stories that my grandmother told me, or that told my brother actually, was came about when she had been at my aunt's bar. My aunt had a bar in the city of Milwaukee, where commonly known as an Indian bar. I think originally those got going because Native people weren't allowed in bars that were owned by white people. And eventually there was a whole community of places for Native people to hang out in the city that were Indian bars. And my aunt owned the Arrow Inn in the city of Milwaukee. It's at the corner of Bow and Arrow. And and my grandmother lived with her for a number of years, and they lived upstairs from the bar. So my grandmother often just hung out to socialize with people down in the bar. And this was back in the American Indian movement days, when a lot was happening, and those Indian bars were a conduit for people to meet and talk about things. Anyway, my brother happened to be there, and my grandmother and some gentlemen came in that were Lakota, and they were talking to each other in the Lakota language. And my grandmother started talking to them in their language. And later my brother asked her how she knew Lakota. And she said, well, when they were at Carlisle, they were not allowed to speak their language. They were often isolated from other tribal members, and forced to room with other Native tribes. But whenever they could, they would sneak out and go out to the woods and talk to each other in their language, so they didn't forget it. And they also learned each other's languages. So that's how she learned Lakota. Anyway, I learned a lot from the whole thing. I usually start off a painting with some thumbnail sketches of basically what I will get in my mind as far as the design of the piece goes, because as you can see from the other pieces, they're usually fairly structured. So I start off with those thumbnail sketches, and then I I do a series of drawings, and I do my drawings on tracing paper because watercolor paper is very unforgiving. It any eraser marks that you make will affect the quality of the paper, the surface of the paper, and it affects the way the paint goes into the paper. And so I try to minimize those as much as possible. And the way I do that is I do the sketches that I'm going to use for the piece on a separate piece of paper, and I use tracing paper so that I can then turn it over and go over the lines again on the back, and then lay it on to the watercolor paper and tape it in place. And then I go over the lines again, and it works almost like a carbon. It actually transfers onto the paper. And I do that to minimize the lines. You can see I'm going to have all these smaller figures that are basically the uniform that you would wear at Carlisle. And every once in a while, I'm going to pop into a person in native dress. There's a positive side of that story is that my grandmother came home at age 18 and met my grandfather, who was another Oneida, and married him and spoke Oneida for the rest of her life. So she did manage to retain some culture. However, the assimilation did work in that she did not pass on many of the traditions and culture and language to her children. But yeah, here's another piece with the little figures. So it can become quite involved doing all of that. And I use transparent watercolor, which is very unforgiving. You cannot cover up your mistakes at all. It's different from what a lot of artists call watercolor, which is actually just water-based paint, and it's opaque, and you can cover that up just as an oil painting. But true watercolor, transparent watercolor, you cannot do that. I'm gonna take you over and show you my palette that I work with. It looks very clean right now, but it's not usually quite that clean once I get going on a painting. I basically work with a large pan of water for cleaning my brushes and a smaller pan of water inside of that for clean water. And I frequently have to change that. My skylight is, the sun is starting to come through my skylight. And let's see what else. The way I mount I learned this from a magazine years ago. The way I mount my watercolor paper when I'm working on it, as anyone who has worked in watercolor knows, that as the paper gets wet, watercolor tends to buckle. And over the years, I have turned to a very heavy watercolor paper. It's 300-pound cold press, and it buckles a lot less, but I still need to mount it on something. And I used to tape it all down and go through a whole process. I'm kind of lazy, so I found a easier way to do it. And it also actually allows me to manipulate the painting when I'm working on it. So it's basically styrofoam board like that you would use to insulate a house. And when I actually get going on this full speed, I'll have a lot more pins in it, but I actually pin it to the board while I'm working on it, and that keeps it relatively flat. In the end, I have to go through another process of flattening it to get all the buckles out before I frame it. But that helps a lot. As I said, I'm just really getting started on this piece. The borders in the long run are gonna show Iroquois beadwork design, and it'll go all around. And I'm debating whether to put either the school or the graveyard at the school into the painting. But so I also, in addition to working in true transparent watercolor, I also work in a very controlled style. And people always wonder how I get the crisp edges in my painting. And that is basically by, I paint a line. And let me know if you can see this, ladies. I actually paint the outline around the outline of the piece. And I use two brushes, at least two brushes at all time. One is containing the pigment and the other just water, so I can control the movement of the watercolor. And I also keep a tissue handy so that if things get away from me, I can stop it. And later on, I will go back around the inside of that line, the other side of that line, and start painting on that edge. And that kind of creates an outline, and it gives you that very crisp edge. So it is a very controlled style. And the patience required has to do with not working on an area when it's wet. To work on the other side of the line, you need to wait until it's completely dry, which is another advantage to using this nice lightweight board. I used to use a heavier plywood to mount my watercolor paper on, but the advantage of using this insulation board is it's very light, and I can maneuver it and turn it to different places, so that while I'm waiting for one area to dry, I can work on another area. And so I always have somewhere where I can work, where I'm not sitting there waiting for the paint to dry. And thankfully, watercolor dries fairly quickly, and I live in a fairly dry place. So in fact, we're having a drought here in Santa Fe, but that also hastens the drying time. So some pigments, like this blue that I'm using, which I use a lot of because I use a lot of, I guess it's my woodland background. I use a lot of blues and greens and purples. And some pigments, you can have a fair amount of time before they actually sink into the paper. So if you do make a mistake, I'll make a little mistake here. You can actually lift that off for a certain amount of time. And that's a combination of using that heavier watercolor paper, as well as using a pigment that is not a staining pigment. So this is more of a floaty kind of pigment that will, with the water, you'll be able to move it around for a while. Unlike some of the more earthy pigments, which I will demonstrate a little bit with those, they are a lot trickier to work with because they're called staining pigments, and they have a tendency to sink right into the paper. So you have a lot less time to manipulate them. I am not really liking that particular color very much, so I will keep that very light. So you have a certain amount of latitude in laying those staining pigments in, but it's much less forgiving than the non-staining pigments. And I have read books about which pigments are staining and which are not. And I would say experiment with them, because I don't find the books necessarily to be that accurate about the nature of the individual pigments. And I think, as you saw, I use tubes of watercolor paint, and I just squirt it out as I need it, and it will dry on my palette, but I can still use it, just like, the old praying watercolors that we used in school that had the little watercolor cakes. It's the same thing. It's just that they're blobs on my palette instead, but it's the same thing. So I guess to reiterate, the more important part about watercolor painting is to use really good paper and have it mounted. If you use cheap paper or thin paper, you're never going to have a good result. You just aren't, because the paper can't handle the water that you need to do the painting. So that's always the first thing I tell people when they ask me how I do my paintings is use good paper, use heavier paper. The heavier paper is a little harder to work with. The 300-pound paper that I work with, most watercolor painters, I would say, use the next smallest, the next heaviest paper, which is 140 pounds, but it's significantly thinner, and it's very nice because you can make smoother lines and such. The heavier paper has a little bit of a ripple through it, a texture to it that affects how you can make your fine lines. But once you get used to it, it's great. It's really great paper. And the other thing is to make sure your paper is mounted correctly, as I said, so that you're not going to get big ripples, because again, you'll never get a good result if that is the case. And probably when I get to that point where the painting is essentially done, I will begin to incorporate some beadwork in here. I haven't totally decided about that yet, because I haven't quite worked out exactly what pattern I'm going to use, and I'll decide, I guess, once I see it. Again, I have all these photographic references, and I have a photo of the Carlisle Indian School, the famous shot of all the kids that went to school there. There were tens of thousands of kids that went to school there, or young people, and only, I think, a few hundred actually graduated. Here's the graveyard. It was very common for the kids to run away. They missed their homes. But one of the more interesting things that I found out just in my recent research is I knew my grandmother had gone on these, what they called, outings, and what we understood was that she had been promised an education when she went there. She was sort of at the end of the boarding school era. In fact, she was there the year it closed. So she was promised an education, and also promised that she'd be able to go home in the summer And that proved not to be the case, because if you didn't have the money to pay to go home, then you couldn't go home. And so I noticed on her registration card, which is in the archives, you can see that she went on outings for entire summers. And it turns out that what outings were they were basically sent out as servants or workers. The men would be sent out, the boys would be sent out to work on a farm or a factory or whatever. But the girls would be selected by white families to work as a servant. And my grandmother, we did know that she had worked for a doctor in some European family that and didn't get to go home. She worked as a maid. And in my research, I found that other more distant family members had gone to Carlisle, and I found one that had been there, and she's talked about in the book, Sky Woman Lives in Me, that she was there for 3 days and was sent to work as a maid. And she was there with her sister, and her sister didn't see her again for 11 years. And her sister was there for a year, and then she got selected to be a maid. And she worked as a maid for 11 years. She never went back to the school until she finally went home for a visit and chose to stay there. And they were not happy about that. The school was not happy about that, nor were the people she worked for, although she had a pretty good relationship with them. But anyway, apparently that was not uncommon. And it was very quickly realized that so the government would pay to have for each student that was at the school. And so the record showed that they were students there, but they weren't. They were working as maids or workers in factories, and they were forced to send half their wages to Carlisle, supposedly to be put in savings for them. But I know that many never got that money, and then they were not paid well either. They got a pretty nominal wage. They were kind of like indentured servants, and I guess they quickly discovered at Carlisle that this was a great money-making scheme, and yet they thought they were doing a good thing because they were assimilating these Indians. And some of them never went home at all. And sadly, many of them did forget their language and their culture, especially the ones who came as younger children. So by the time they went back home, they didn't fit in with their families anymore. So it's a bad story. I guess the triumph is that we were not totally assimilated, and we did keep some of our culture, but yeah, there are other ways to wipe out a people, and that's what this painting is all about. So if anybody has any questions that's watching this and wants to know anything more about the technique, I will be happy to share that. But so I will work on all parts of the painting. I don't like to concentrate just on one area, so it stays balanced. Because if you focus too much on one small area, it tends to take too much attention, and the rest of the painting suffers from it. So I'm going to work on this arm. And I start off with a single layer of color. And some watercolorists will not mix any color on their palette. They do all their color mixing on the page, but I do both. So anyway, I would move to another area of the painting and start working there. So what you can't see here very well is that I'm just adding water to the pigment that I have on my palette so that I can get it the right consistency to work with, and then move around. And like I said, I always work with 2 brushes, and that one will just have water in it. And it allows me to manipulate the paint where I want it to go and how thick I want it to go on. And usually as I work, I figure out more elements of the painting and color, because I like to see one color next to another color before I decide exactly which way I'll go. But I usually have a pretty good idea when I start of at least the color theme that I'm wanting to use, and then take it from there. So yeah, that's the advantage of working on the insulation board, is to be able to easily manipulate it. Yes, and apparently many children died at Carlisle. There's a record of, I don't know, less than 200, I think, are listed as dying there over a period of, I think it was 40 years that the school was open, something like that. But it's clear that the records were falsified about some things, because we know that, there were people that were sent on these outings that were listed as being students. And by the way, as a student, what you learned was that apparently half a day was spent teaching you English, and the other half of the day was teaching domestic or industrial skills. So for the boys, it would be, print shop. They had a print shop, or farming, or other industrial arts. And the women were taught domestic skills, cooking and cleaning and so on. So that's the education that was provided at Carlisle. I have not been able to find anything about, teaching them literature or anything like that. And all of their clothing would have been taken away when they arrived, if it was native clothing, and destroyed, and they were given a uniform to wear. And then later they would make their own clothes. Even their shoes, I think, would be made at this school. And I'm sure the government had a stipend for them, and they had sponsors. And a lot of people thought they were doing good things by assimilating these Indians. Sketches done. To see them actually appear as you get the paint on them. So on this piece, the little background figures, the tiny figures, which are dressed in the maids' uniforms, they will basically be kind of a wallpaper behind the grandmother figure who's weaving the basket. And I haven't decided yet if I'm going to include some little baskets in the corners or something like that. I think I might do that, but I haven't completely decided on that yet. So the other thing I do is block printing, relief printing, which probably all of you did in school at one point or another, carved a linoleum block and did a print from it. Well, I do that too, but they tend to be a little more complex. But I do have some on my website if people want to see them. And I have small ones and I have some larger pieces too. And I like to actually mix the media. Usually on my block prints, I use black ink. So they're black ink on white paper, but then I go back in later and color the lighter areas with watercolor. And so because I'm working on these figures as almost a kind of a wallpaper, I'm not going to paint them in actual colors. I'm going to paint them so that they kind of look like wallpaper. So there's, and I'm not sure exactly what direction I will go in the end as far as color goes, but I'm going to start off by using this blue layer for the whole thing, but still defining the features and everything, but just not in realistic color, unlike the grandmother figure who will be. And actually, I have the drawings scattered here and there of the woman in native dress, and those will be in full color as well. So I don't know. I'm just kind of deciding as I go along what direction I will go in. So when the watercolor is completed, that's when I will decide whether I add the beadwork to it. And once I do that, then I can work on matting and framing. So if I add beadwork, that means I have to have a special sort of mat to put over the piece so that, and sometimes I do layers as well. I do what I call sculptural watercolors, where I do multiple layers that are cut out and laid over the other one, just to kind of break out of the box of the two-dimensional format. When I do that, then I have to mat it specially so that it has basically a shadow box effect, so that the elements that are raised up, the beads and the layers, will not touch the glass, because a watercolor has to be framed with glass. I use conservation glass, which protects it from most of the UV rays. It's not 100% effective, but it's in the 90s generally. And but I still ask people not to hang their watercolors in direct sunlight because they will fade over time. But the shadow box effect then will keep the glass from touching both the painting and the beadwork that I might add to it. So that's all part of the process. And I've been doing the dimensional watercolors, the sculptural watercolors for many years now. seems like that's a later innovation, but it's actually been probably for 20 some years that I've been doing those. And again, on my website, you can see some examples of that. But I don't think I will be adding layers to this one. This one will just be two-dimensional, except for the beadwork that I might add later on. And I'm going to keep everything really light at this point because I may want to change the color a little bit. But this will define the features for me, and then I'll be able to go back in later and make any changes I want to. As I said, it's a process that requires a lot of patience, so it's probably kind of boring to watch because it's very painstaking. Maybe the idle jerk can speed it up for you so you you can see it. I should do a time-lapse video is what I should do, but it is a very meditative process, so that's kind of nice. Put you kind of in a Zen mode until you make a mistake, then you get upset. So yeah, I just like to get to the point where I can kind of see where I'm at, and the pencil line can start to go away. When it's completely dry and I have everything defined as much as possible, then I will start erasing once, it doesn't matter so much that the surface is affected. It will already have a layer of watercolor on it. So it's going to take more watercolor without too much of a problem. But I use the kneadable erasers, which are less abrasive to the paper. So it's all about protecting the surface of the paper. Paper also that I used has a coating on it too. When they make it, they put a coating on it, which again allows you to manipulate the paint on it for a longer period of time. As we work, the figures will become more and more defined, and able to start developing them more once the basic outlines are done, and it will evolve on its own, and we'll see how it all turns out in the end.